The American League almost fell apart in 1902. Okay, that might be a somewhat dramatic statement, but it's really not as exaggerated as you might think. As the traditional story goes, John McGraw took the best players away from the Baltimore Orioles on July 17, 1902, and took them up to New York, where they joined the Giants. Essentially, the New York Giants purchased the American League's Baltimore Orioles in what was by far the biggest attack in the old baseball wars. This caused Ban Johnson and the American League to scramble. History has remembered McGraw as a kind of Benedict Arnold, a treacherous villain who would have done anything to make a quick buck. Okay, we need to talk about this. Now, whether you're talking about baseball, you're talking about a country's history, whatever it is you're talking about, anytime you see history clearly divided between the heroes and the villains, you know that you've got a problem. Why? Because life just isn't that simple. Nothing is all bad, just as nothing is all good. So let's turn back the clock a little bit and see what we can learn about this event, especially from the original newspapers. If you look back to October 1900, you'll see that John McGraw was directly tied with the idea of sticking an American League team in Baltimore. In fact, the concept itself of a team in Baltimore was tied so closely with John McGraw that the two kind of went together in every newspaper article about it. I don't think that fans back then could have imagined having the Orioles back without having the great Oriole captain in charge. McGraw was frustrated when the Baltimore Orioles were contracted after the 1899 season. He famously held out for 2 months instead of going to the St. Louis Cardinals, who now owned his contract. In 1900, John McGraw made an incredible $10,000 for his partial season in St. Louis. His contract had no reserve clause, and he also wound up becoming de facto manager of the team halfway through the season. I've talked about this before in earlier videos and blog articles, which you can check out for more details. Now, McGraw was an absolutely huge star. He was both a fantastic player and a man who had a carefully cultivated reputation. He had the ferocity and the competitiveness of like a Ty Cobb or a Pete Rose or even a Michael Jordan. He combined that with the name recognition and the star power of Reggie Jackson. And then he had the leadership skills that outshined the likes of Casey Stengel, not to mention, say, Billy Martin. In short, this guy was a huge, huge star, and he wasn't even 30 years old yet. Now, there were rumors right from the start that McGraw might go up to New York instead of running the Orioles for Ban Johnson. We also know that Ban Johnson had his eyes on New York even before his Western League was renamed the American League. He alludes to those aspirations here in the last paragraph of this February 1900 Chicago Sunday Tribune article. Chicago's population at the time was 1.7 million. New York's population, on the other hand, was 3.5 million. In the end, though, McGraw decided to go with Johnson back to Baltimore. In fact, McGraw put his own money down on the line, becoming part owner of the club. Now, this is often forgotten when this story is told, but it really is an important note. McGraw famously tried to sign black player Charlie Grant to play for the Orioles in March 1901. He called him a Native American named Tocohama. Unfortunately, the other American League owners refused to let the deal go forward. At the same time, old Orioles player Hugh Jennings decided to take the first half of the season off to finish his law school year at Cornell, and McGraw wanted to sign him. You see, McGraw's strategy with the Baltimore Orioles was to pull together as many of his old teammates as he could. And you know, when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, the Baltimore Orioles had been incredibly successful in the National League in the mid-1890s, and of course, John McGraw sensed that they could win again. McGraw went in for players like middle infielder Bill Keister, who played with McGraw in both Baltimore and St. Louis beforehand. Keister was 29 in 1901, right in the middle of his prime. Then there was 32-year-old Steve Brodie, another old Baltimore standout who had helped the Chicago White Stockings to the American League pennant in 1900. The aging Wilbur Robinson, another old Oriole, played catcher at the ripe old age of 37. Harry Howell, who had pitched for the Orioles in 1899, came on as a pitcher. So did the Iron Man, Joe McGinnity, only 30 years old and with another 7 years of eating innings ahead of him. Frank Foreman was another old Oriole pitcher who came on board nearing the end of his career. The same was true of Jerry Knops, another old Oriole. Frederick Schmidt, commonly known by his nickname Crazy, played briefly with McGraw and impressed him so much that McGraw went out of his way to find him. Crazy, of course, didn't last very long. Well, it wasn't exactly the same as the old Orioles, but it was really close. There's no question that McGraw wanted to go after Hugh Jennings. He was probably interested in some of his other old teammates as well, say Wee Willie Keeler or Joe Kelly, for example. Those guys were all star players over in Brooklyn. It's not that hard to see what McGraw's strategy was. I bring this up because most historians ignore the Jennings part of the story. It's obscure, sure, but it's also important. Anyway, John McGraw had a history of altercations with umpires, and it only took him a couple of weeks to be kicked out of a game. You probably remember this because I talked about it just a little while ago. McGraw was ejected for arguing balls and strikes in a game in Philadelphia. This was the same game that featured Crazy Schmidt lying on the ground in protest. Officially, however, McGraw was suspended not for arguing balls and strikes, but for cursing at an umpire. However, if you look closely, you'll realize that McGraw was only suspended for 5 days, not 5 games. The reality is that McGraw didn't miss a single game thanks to rainouts. And if you remember my earlier video, you'll know that this problem wasn't necessarily just McGraw. I mean, there was only one umpire at that game in Philadelphia, and the same is true of almost all American League games in those days. And if you think that Angel Hernandez was bad, just wait. Many historians ignore this, but even the Sporting News reported that the umpiring in that Philadelphia game was horrible. It's not an excuse for fighting, of course, but there are questions in hindsight about whether Johnson could have done something to avoid these complaints. McGraw lost it at an umpire just a few weeks later, and this time Ban Johnson was at the ball game, which was held in Chicago. While McGraw was indeed ejected, he was not suspended, which might be a tacit admission by Johnson that his umpires weren't always right. This is something that I really want to emphasize. Most historians who have written about John McGraw in 1901 and 1902 really have not taken the time to look closely at the game-by-game accounts and records. In fact, when you take a close look, especially at the newspapers, you quickly realize that the famous John McGraw was actually only suspended 1 time by Ban Johnson in 1901. Now, that's not to say that McGraw was innocent. In fact, at least one fan wrote into the Baltimore Sun to complain about all this whining. Those of you who have played sports will recognize this sentiment. Basically, it goes something like, stop crying about the bad calls and focus on the game. McGraw's public response, however, was to double down, saying that the fault lied completely with the umpires. And anyway, that's the reason why I'm not convinced that John McGraw was completely in the wrong here. Again, Ban Johnson was at that game in Chicago in late May, which is what instigated those articles. And Johnson didn't suspend McGraw, even after McGraw made his complaints public. In the meantime, it looks like Jennings was a lock for the Orioles. However, Ban Johnson came out and ruled that Jennings belonged to the Philadelphia Athletics, not the Baltimore Orioles. This is pretty complicated. In fact, this is so complicated that I really don't understand it all that well. There is no historical evidence, at least that I've seen, that Connie Mack went after Hugh Jennings. Ban Johnson claimed that American League owners agreed in secret back in October 1900 that they were only going to sign 4 National League defectors per team. However, John McGraw noted at the time correctly that other American League teams had signed more than 4 defectors already. This is where I really start wondering if Ban Johnson didn't have it in for John McGraw. Jennings showed up in Baltimore on June 19th, though it wasn't clear that he could play for Baltimore. Notably, Jennings stated that he had no desire to play in Philadelphia at all. Johnson stood his ground, and Jennings decided to go back to Brooklyn, the team that had his National League contract. The very next day, Jennings was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies, where he played until he became manager of the Detroit Tigers in 1907. The official line was that Jennings couldn't agree to terms with Connie Mack. The real story, however, is that Jennings only wanted to play with McGraw. Once he found out that he couldn't, he abandoned any thought of going to the American League. You could argue that Johnson in this case sacrificed the good of the league and the potential for completely putting the National League out of business for his hatred of McGraw. And then came allegations from Ban Johnson that John McGraw was trying to sabotage the American League. I'm not sure if any of these were true or not. Once again, I'm just bringing this up to show that it wasn't exactly a one-way fight. On July 12th, McGraw's knee was injured when a Washington runner slid hard into third base. McGraw actually stayed in this game and went up to bat in the bottom of the inning. He connected for what was a sure double, but then collapsed as he ran to first. He was thrown out left field to shortstop to first base and had to take himself out of the game. McGraw was out of action until late August when he tried to come back again. He was still managing though, although the newspapers note that he was on the sidelines in a cast. But that didn't stop the accusations of treachery. Johnson claimed now that McGraw was trying to convince 4 American League clubs to move to the National League. While it is probably true that this was just a rumor, we do know in hindsight that McGraw was indeed secretly meeting with baseball men in New York as a sort of insurance plan. And then came one of the most violent incidents in early baseball history. Since he couldn't get Jennings, McGraw had to make do with the pastiche of first baseman. That included Jimmy Hart, who had been a minor league star. Hart was playing in his first major league season at age 25. On August 5th, Hart connected for a long drive. He went barreling around second base into third and was called out in a close play. Hart, who was normally soft-spoken, lost control and wound up punching the umpire in the face. McGraw intervened to keep the men apart, and reports have it that McGraw threw himself between the men to break up the fight. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why it's so important to actually review the original newspaper articles. So for example, in his 1955 book on the old Baltimore Orioles, Fred Lieb claimed that Hart had been egged on by McGraw, and then he claimed that Hart had been suspended for life because of this fight. Neither of those claims are even remotely true. It gets worse. In a 2012 article for his official blog, MLB historian John Thorne repeated the claim that Hart had been suspended for life. He also continued to insinuate that McGraw was at fault. It is true that Hart was suspended, and he should have been, obviously. However, that suspension was lifted on August 14th. Hart's Sabre biography correctly notes that Jimmy was suspended only briefly and that he played for a few weeks afterwards before leaving the Orioles for good. Jimmy Hart left the Orioles in late August. The reason why is because John McGraw refused to pay his fine for him. Again, this is one of those things that should make you wonder whether John McGraw hasn't been unfairly treated by history. Meanwhile, Johnson suspended Joe McGinnity for 10 days on August 20th for reasons that are completely mysterious to me. McGraw joked to the Baltimore Morning Herald that Johnson would suspend the scorecard vendor if he knew his name. Well, I have searched and I've searched, but I can't find any reason for that McGinnity suspension. It's a complete mystery to me. Let me know if you know why it happened. But you do have to be careful. Fred Lieb, again, claimed that the suspension lasted until the end of the season, but that's not true. McGinnity, in fact, pitched almost every other day in September 1901. While all of this was going on, McGraw's knee started hurting him, causing him to stop playing for the rest of the season. The Baltimore Sun reported on August 26th that McGraw had retired as a player. This was a bit premature, perhaps, but it gives you an idea of how much pain he was in. That same day, the Orioles beat the Milwaukee Brewers despite having only 10 active players show up at the park. And that brings us to the end of 1901. Again, John McGraw was only suspended a single time in the entire 1901 season, or at least that's all I've been able to find. The books and the articles that claim that he was constantly suspended really should cite their sources. In spring training, the Baltimore Press reported that McGraw's leg had completely mended and that he was as good as new. The Orioles began the season in Boston, playing in front of an immense crowd of over 16,000 fans. This was a sign that the American League experiment was indeed working, especially since the Boston Braves were also at home that same day. McGraw didn't play at first, however. Joe Kelly, the old Oriole who McGraw was finally able to get from Brooklyn, was playing at third. Meanwhile, Jimmy Sheckard, another jumper from Brooklyn, was playing in the outfield. Sheckard didn't last long, however. As you probably know, the Napoleon LaJoie case was resolved in court in Pennsylvania in April 1902, and the American League lost. Sheckard was scared by this decision and decided on the spot to return to Brooklyn instead of risking legal action. And so, although he was almost certainly hobbled, McGraw played in his familiar position at third base on April 28th. This sets us up for one of the most bizarre incidents in John McGraw's career. The May 1st game in Baltimore against the Red Sox nearly caused a riot. In the bottom of the ninth inning, with a 2-2 count on him, McGraw was hit by a pitch. However, the umpire ruled that McGraw had deliberately stepped in front of the pitch and threw him out of the game when he protested. Even the Boston Globe derided this call as awful, and looking back, I wonder how much sense it makes that a man with an aching knee would deliberately step in front of a pitch like that. The fans rioted and somebody threw a brick at the umpire, which fortunately missed. The result was another 5-day suspension for John McGraw, his second in the American League. You see what I mean by John McGraw's side of the story? Now, when I look at this, I've got to wonder what in the world Ban Johnson was doing, spending so much time and energy worrying about going to New York City with one of the American League teams. I mean, if Ban Johnson really was this champion of clean baseball that some claim he was, why didn't he do something about the ridiculous state of umpiring in his own league? It all came crashing down for McGraw on May 24th when he was spiked in another on-field incident. This injury practically ended McGraw's 1902 season as a player. And this is where the downfall begins. McGraw had only been back for a few days when he was thrown out of the game on June 28th against Boston. The umpire forfeited the game to the Red Sox. McGraw wasn't involved in the play this time. A situation arose in the 8th inning with 2 Oriole runners on third base. One returned to second safely and the lead runner wound up safe at third, but the umpire then inexplicably called the runner at second out. This was the sort of play that wouldn't have been a controversy if there was a second umpire present, and we can only guess at how many plays like this there were in the early years of the American League. Newspapers noted that McGraw didn't engage in kicking or any cursing during the argument, and that fans were shocked when the umpire threw him out of the game anyway. The result was McGraw's third suspension, this one an indefinite suspension. In fact, both McGraw and Kelly were suspended indefinitely, apparently for their reactions to the same play. Okay, now, of course, and as you know, there was no Sports Center back in those days. Ban Johnson relied heavily on reports that came to him from his umpires. But, you know, as you've probably guessed by now, Johnson really didn't bother to investigate much further than just reading the umpires' reports. You have to wonder if he couldn't have stopped some of this ugliness if he had taken a different approach. Reports came out right away that McGraw was considering selling his stock in the Orioles. This grainy article comes from the Sporting News on July 5th, for example. On July 8th, the Baltimore Sun reported in a long article that McGraw was going to become the new manager of the New York Giants, who were stuck in last place in the National League. This article included a long discussion of McGraw's time in Baltimore, as well as a lament about how his treatment had been so heavily influenced by his reputation. And then, on July 9th, the same newspaper reported that McGraw had been given his unconditional release by the Baltimore Orioles, and that his stock in the club was sold to Orioles president John J. Mahon. I'm bringing this up because it really surprised me when I found out about it. Yeah, it turns out that John McGraw's move to New York was no surprise, and it didn't happen overnight. Everybody could see this coming. In other words, Ban Johnson had ample time to plan out his next move. Now, the part that comes up next is really confusing. I'm going to do my best to try to simplify this. The New York Giants were owned by a man named Andrew Friedman. According to Fred Lieb, Friedman made an attempt to take over the National League in the winter from 1901 to 1902. This happened after the American League had completely obliterated the National League in terms of gate receipts and attendance. Friedman was not successful. Allegedly, for a while, he was looking into buying up an American League team to move up to New York City, but he was blocked in that attempt as well. Friedman, however, was not the mastermind behind the John McGraw deal. That honor went to Cincinnati Reds owner John T. Brush, and that's a name that you're certainly familiar with. With Brush's financial backing, Friedman not only signed John McGraw to another $10,000 a year contract, but he also purchased all the shares of the Baltimore Orioles that belonged to John Mahon. That would be 201 of the 400 total shares, which gave Friedman a majority. This is confusing, by the way, because Friedman did not make this purchase under his own name. I mean, you know how these business deals work, right? It was a shadow purchase, and it just so happens that the purchaser was a major player, or major owner, I should say, in the rival league. Friedman gave McGraw complete control over the New York Giants as far as baseball was concerned. This made McGraw both manager and general manager. I guess you could consider this similar to the kind of control that Whitey Herzog had over the St. Louis Cardinals in the 1980s. This sort of thing really doesn't happen anymore these days, and I think it's a shame. Now, McGraw's exit itself was huge news. However, if you look closely, you'll see that newspapermen predicted that a raid of the Orioles could happen, such as in this Sporting Life article dated July 12th. In the end, Mahon sold his stock to Friedman, who promptly released as many Oriole players as would accept a release. A group went up to New York with McGraw. This included Joe McGinnity and Roger Bresnahan, two later Hall of Famers. And in the end, Joe Kelly wound up signing for the Cincinnati Reds, who, as you recall, were owned by John Brush. Now, if you think that all that was complicated, just wait. About 200 people showed up to the American League ballpark in Baltimore on July 17th. Only 5 of them were Orioles players. The Orioles didn't submit a lineup, and no Baltimore players took the field. This resulted in a forfeit after a 5-minute delay. Ban Johnson then sprung into action, declaring that the Baltimore Orioles franchise had been forfeited to the American League as a result. I'll let the lawyers out there comment on this one. The reasoning for Johnson's takeover included allegedly disbanding the team during the season, failing to present a team to play in a regular season game, and disposing of players that promptly joined the National League. There was no legal challenge to all of this, though I really think that there could have been one. I mean, for one thing, the players weren't actually transferred to the National League. They were released and were technically free agents. They could sign for whichever team they wanted. And of course, it's not like there was a national agreement at that time because the American League had already breached that in 1901. Plus, forfeiting an entire franchise because a game was forfeited, that strikes me as really harsh. But you know, I guess the desperate times call for desperate measures. Johnson then cobbled together a team made of marginal players from other American League teams who joined the Orioles on loan. That's how they ended the 1902 season. Historians who encounter this should ask questions about who really owned these teams. I mean, I can't think of any precedents in baseball history or in the history of any other sport for a league president ordering teams to loan players to another team to finish out the season, which is what Johnson did here. Of course, you do realize that Ban Johnson had to act this way. He had to protect the legitimacy of the American League. I mean, think about it. If the Baltimore Orioles had collapsed at this point, late July 1902, and had not finished their schedule, the American League would have looked completely incompetent and weak. It would have looked like anything but a top-flight major league. And I think that Johnson, who was an old newspaper man, fully understood that. We could go on and on from here, but I think you get the point. Sporting Life devoted 2 full pages to this controversy, covering it from all conceivable angles. Among other things, the Sporting Life predicted that the Orioles would be transferred to New York City, which is exactly what happened that December. Now, if you read McGraw's autobiography, you'll notice that he claims to have gone to New York not because of the suspension, but because of the threat of the Orioles being moved up to New York. This is something that, as we said, Ban Johnson clearly had in mind as far back as 1900. Like it or not, McGraw is correct when he remarks that he received his release from the Orioles legally and that there was no jumping involved. McGraw also notes that he only agreed to go to the Giants when he had a promise that he would have full control over baseball operations. The quest to put together the best team money could buy is what actually put an end to McGraw's playing career. He played for a little while for the Giants, but then shifted his attention toward putting together a better ball club. In the end, the National League-friendly 1903 Spalding Guide completely ignored the incident. The American League-friendly Reach Guide, meanwhile, attacked McGraw's character, and that is the story that has come down over the years. Anyway, when you sit down and you really think about this, you'll realize that things could have been a lot different. I mean, there is no inevitability of history. Things could have gone a whole bunch of different ways, and because things ended up happening in one way doesn't mean that that had to happen. Now, I don't want to say that John McGraw was completely innocent here. I mean, he was arguing with umpires like it was going out of style. That reputation that he had built up was at least somewhat deserved. However, when I look closely at this, I cannot help but conclude that Ban Johnson made a number of mistakes that got himself into this awful position. You know, the most striking thing for me is that Ban Johnson really could have acted right after McGraw was released to try to save the Orioles, and yet it seemed that he deliberately waited, and I've got to conclude that this is because he wanted to move them to New York City. Not long after the McGraw move took place, Brush sold the Reds to Gary Herman. A month later, Friedman had sold the Giants to Brush, and John Brush stood ready to create one of the biggest dynasties in baseball history. This old and crumbling historical marker on Coogan's Bluff notes that the stairway was named for John T. Brush. It was a monument to a man whose financial and business acumen catapulted his team to the top of the game for decades. But like the McGraw incident, the stairway is largely forgotten. It's a crumbling monument to a time and a man that history has long ignored.